A German radar post blinked out on coastal surveillance near Le Havre. Operators adjusted their equipment, checking connections in the cold Atlantic wind. The smell of salt air mixed with diesel from backup generators. Within 17 minutes, the Würzburg array, vital to Luftwaffe early warning coverage, fell permanently silent. British intercept operators at Baudsee noted the gap in their logs. The sea remained dark. The wind carried no sound of bombers. Later analysis confirmed what seemed impossible. Components of the Würzburg radar had been physically removed and carried away. The mission Operation Biting, executed by 120 men of the Second Battalion Parachute Regiment, was the first successful British airborne raid in occupied Europe. German engineers believed their radar sites were invulnerable to commando action. Fences, cliffs, and coastal patrols should have made such an operation impossible. The British removed one under their noses and evacuated by sea before dawn. 2 days later, the Luftwaffe High Command ordered a total review of radar security across France. A single-night operation forced Germany to rewire its air defense network. Guards doubled. Patrols intensified. Resources diverted from frontline duties. This is the story of how a threat from nowhere paralyzed an empire. A short directive crossed a War Office desk in late June, 1940. Prime Minister Winston Churchill's instruction was clear. Raise a corps of parachute troops. The memo ran to fewer than 200 words. It referenced German airborne successes in Norway, the Netherlands, and the fortress of Ebenemael. The enemy had demonstrated vertical envelopment. Britain possessed no equivalent capability. The German assault on Crete in May 1941 demonstrated both the power and cost of airborne operations. Over 22,000 German paratroopers and mountain troops descended on the island. They seized Maleme airfield despite horrific casualties. Over 6,000 killed or wounded. The British garrison evacuated. Churchill observed the operation with concern and admiration in equal measure. If Germany could project force from the sky, Britain must develop the same capability. RAF Ringway, near Manchester, became the central landing establishment. The facility was modest. A grass airfield, converted hangars, and improvised training equipment. Initial training cadre numbered 500 volunteers drawn from commando units. These men were self-selected risk-takers, drawn to the novelty and danger of parachute operations. Equipment was rudimentary in the extreme. Converted Whitley bombers served as jump platforms. Paratroopers exited through a hole cut in the fuselage floor, an ungainly and dangerous method. Harnesses were improvised from parachute designs borrowed from RAF escape systems used by bomber crews. The parachutes themselves were static line activated, pulled open by a cord attached to the aircraft as the jumper fell away. Doctrine was embryonic, assembled from observation of German operations and trial and error on English drop zones. Instructors studied captured German training manuals and interviewed intelligence officers who had observed Fallschirmjäger operations. The learning process was rapid but painful. Injuries were common. Broken bones, sprains, and concussions marked the training records. By late 1941, No. 2 Commando transferred wholesale into what became the Parachute Regiment. The unit brought combat experience and aggressive leadership. Instructors came from RAF and Army cooperation units, blending aviation expertise with ground tactics. Training focused on night jumps, rapid assembly after landing, and demolition tasks. The parachute soldiers learned to operate in small groups without direct support behind enemy lines. The learning curve was steep and unforgiving. Injury rates during training ran to 3%, acceptable by wartime standards but indicative of the risks inherent in parachute operations. Some injuries were fatal. Training deaths were recorded, analyzed, and used to improve procedures. Wind limits were established. Landing techniques were refined. Equipment modifications reduced injury rates incrementally. A War Office minute dated June 22, 1940, captured the urgency. The enemy's mastery of descent must be met in kind. German airborne shock in 1940 triggered sustained British investment in training facilities, rigging procedures, airframe modification, and combined arms procedures that would integrate parachute troops with conventional forces. By late 1941, Britain had a credible parachute nucleus. Volunteer numbers climbed toward the thousands. Equipment improved incrementally. The X-type parachute entered service, replacing earlier designs with a more reliable canopy and harness system. Doctrine matured through exercises on Salisbury Plain and in Scotland, where terrain and weather approximated combat conditions. The first operational test would target a resource Germany could least afford to lose: technical secrets embedded in electronic warfare systems. German radar technology was advancing rapidly. British scientists needed to examine actual equipment to develop countermeasures. A raid on a coastal radar station would provide that opportunity. The question was no longer whether Britain could field airborne troops. The question was whether those troops could reach a defended target, accomplish a technical mission, and return alive. Coastal operators at Le Havre noted an unexplained power change at 0121 hours. They assumed equipment failure, a common occurrence with the temperamental radar sets. Maintenance crews would investigate at dawn. On the cliff above Berneville, British sappers worked quickly under moonlight, removing components from the Würzburg radar array. Parabolic dish, receiver assemblies, feed horns, drive mechanisms. Each piece was carefully dismantled according to diagrams prepared from aerial reconnaissance photographs and carried toward the beach. Operation Biting deployed approximately 120 men of the Second Battalion, Parachute Regiment. Company C provided the assault force. A Royal Engineers detachment under the command of Flight Sergeant Charles Cox accompanied the raiders. Cox was a radar specialist who had studied captured German equipment manuals. His mission: identify and remove the most valuable components within a strict time limit. The objective was technically ambitious: seize a German radar installation intact, dismantle critical components, and extract by sea before German reinforcements could respond. Naval motor launches of the Royal Navy waited offshore, timing their approach to coincide with the raid's conclusion. The window for extraction was narrow, less than 30 minutes once the alarm was raised. German planners assumed fences, armed patrols, and steep coastal cliffs precluded dismantling and abduction of a radar set. The installation at Berneville was considered secure. Guards were present but not numerous. The assumption was that no enemy force could reach the site, complete technical work, and escape. Airborne insertion plus naval extraction disproved the model completely. The drops scattered more than planned. Some sticks landed over a mile from their designated zones, caught by stronger winds than forecast. The assembly took longer than planned. Soldiers used whistles and verbal calls to gather in the darkness. Yet within 40 minutes of landing, advance parties reached the radar site. German sentries were neutralized in brief, violent encounters. Engineers moved in with tools and technical diagrams. Flight Sergeant Cox directed the dismantling with calm precision. The parabolic dish came down first. Receiver assemblies were disconnected and packed. The cathode ray display unit, critical for understanding the radar's operating principles, was carried whole. German reinforcements from a nearby garrison heard the firing and began moving toward Berneville. Casualties were light but significant. 2 killed in action, 6 wounded in action, 6 prisoners of war left behind when extraction became impossible. German reinforcements arrived as the raiders withdrew down the cliff path. Covering fire from paratroops held the perimeter long enough for the main party to reach the beach. By 0215 hours, the raiders and their captured components were aboard motor launches heading for Portsmouth. The surf was rough. Some equipment was damaged during the transfer from shore to boat, but the critical components survived intact. Within 48 hours, the Würzburg parts arrived at the Telecommunications Research Establishment at Malvern, where British scientists examined them in detail. Findings informed British countermeasures for the remainder of the war. The Würzburg operated on frequencies that could be jammed or spoofed. Its accuracy was impressive but not invulnerable. The technical data bolstered British confidence in employing chaff, codenamed Window, to disrupt radar-guided defenses. Aluminum strips cut to specific lengths, dropped from bombers, created false returns that overwhelmed German radar operators. The tactical exploitation yielded insights that shaped bombing tactics. Pathfinder squadrons refined their techniques. Electronic warfare units developed jamming equipment tuned to German radar frequencies. The investment in Operation Biting returned dividends that multiplied across hundreds of subsequent bombing missions. A post-operation TRE note dated March 1942 described the Würzburg as precise yet vulnerable to physical interference and poorly sighted against assault. The assessment was clinical but damning. Germany's radar network was sophisticated but inadequately defended. A small raid produced outsized scientific gain and triggered German defensive adjustments around coastal electronics installations across occupied Europe. Guard forces were increased. Fencing was reinforced. Patrol schedules were intensified. The cost of defending radar sites rose sharply. Goebbels' internal commentary acknowledged a new threat vector in terms both worried and grudgingly respectful. The Englishman now lands from the clouds. The propaganda minister understood the psychological impact. If British forces could appear anywhere, strike suddenly, and vanish before effective response, then no installation was truly secure. A staff conference table displayed sortie tables and allocation charts. The numbers represented competing priorities in a resource-constrained war. Bombers needed over the Reich versus aircraft requested for airborne operations. Each column of figures represented lives, missions, and strategic choices. Bomber Command lost 3,000 aircraft in 1942, a staggering attrition rate that demanded constant replacement from production lines. Airborne planners, by contrast, demanded 300 transport planes for each major drop. To traditionalist officers, this seemed an extravagant diversion of scarce resources. Critics called parachute units an aircraft drain. They argued that transport capacity diverted from supply missions weakened frontline formations fighting in North Africa and the Far East. Every C-47 Dakota assigned to airborne training was one less plane carrying ammunition, fuel, or medical supplies to armies in contact. Airborne advocates countered with strategic logic. A few hundred dedicated sorties could yield dividends behind enemy lines far exceeding their cost. Bridges seized before demolition, communications hubs disrupted, headquarters eliminated, and, perhaps most valuable, enemy reserves dispersed to guard against threats that might never materialize. General Frederick Browning commanded airborne forces from his headquarters in London. Browning was a Grenadier Guards officer, disciplined and detail-oriented. He understood that airborne operations required not just brave soldiers but intricate planning, specialized equipment, and flawless execution. Brigadier Richard Gale led the 1st Parachute Brigade, bringing combat experience and an aggressive approach to training. RAF transport command planners developed the unglamorous but essential work of logistics. Loading tables specified how many men, how much equipment, and what configurations fit into each aircraft type. 2 protocols governed glider operations. Navigation aids were tested and refined. The airborne forces depot formalized training curricula, ensuring that new volunteers met consistent standards. Volunteer numbers expanded into the thousands by late 1942. Recruiting posters emphasized elite status and extra pay, parachute money of 2 shillings per day. Men came from line infantry regiments, drawn by the prospect of action and the distinctive maroon beret that signified airborne qualification. Training attrition remained measurable and carefully tracked. Injury rates during jumps, glider landings, and tactical exercises were recorded and analyzed by medical officers. 3% of trainees suffered injuries serious enough to end their airborne careers: broken legs, spinal damage, head trauma. These casualties never saw combat but paid the price of building Britain's airborne capability. Development of glider pilot schools proceeded in parallel with parachute training. The Glider Pilot Regiment formed as a distinct unit within the Army Air Corps. Pilots trained to fly the large Horsa and Hamilcar gliders, then fight as infantry after landing, a unique dual role that required both aviation skill and ground combat proficiency. The British Army standardized rigging for jeeps and 6-pounder anti-tank guns, enabling heavier equipment to accompany assault waves. Engineers designed wooden cradles that secured vehicles inside glider fuselages. Lashing points were reinforced. Load calculations were refined through test flights that measured how weight distribution affected glide characteristics. Browning's formulation captured the doctrine's philosophical essence. The air is our sea. Without it, we do not land, we drown. The statement emphasized that airborne forces were utterly dependent on transport aviation. Without adequate lift, training and courage meant nothing. Institutionalization of airborne capability meant dedicated logistics, glider production programs, and combined planning cells that integrated airborne operations with ground and naval forces. The 1st Airborne Division stood up formally in 1942, with divisional headquarters, supporting arms, and organic transport elements. Equipment procurement accelerated through 1942 and into 1943. The Horsa glider entered full production, manufactured by furniture companies whose woodworking expertise translated well to aircraft construction. Each Horsa was designed to carry 25 troops or a jeep with a 6-pounder anti-tank gun. The larger Hamilcar glider could lift light tanks or tractors, vehicles that dramatically increased airborne units' combat power after landing. By mid-1942, Britain possessed an airborne arm capable of battalion-scale operations with organic heavy weapons. The next step required validation in hostile conditions against an alert and competent enemy. Approval came for a deep-weather, long-range glider strike against a heavily guarded target in occupied Norway. Success would prove the concept's viability for strategic missions. Failure would be lethal and instructive, a harsh test of men and machines. The mission, codenamed Operation Freshman, aimed at the Vemork heavy water plant deep in the Telemark region. Heavy water was critical to German atomic research. Destroying the plant would set back that research program by months or years. It would test every element of British airborne doctrine in winter conditions over mountainous terrain against a well-defended objective far from friendly lines. Halifax tugs towed Horsa gliders toward the Telemark Plateau through darkness and deteriorating weather. Icing formed on wings and control surfaces within minutes of crossing the Norwegian coast. Wind gusts exceeded forecast limits by 20 knots. Navigation errors compounded as cloud cover obscured landmarks that pilots needed for visual reference. The mission profile demanded precision under impossible conditions. A long tow over mountains exceeding 6,000 feet elevation, release at precise coordinates, glide to landing zones near the Vemork plant, execute demolition, then exfiltrate via resistance networks through snow-covered wilderness. Reality diverged catastrophically from the plan. Both gliders crashed. The first struck a mountainside at high speed. The impact killed 8 men instantly. Survivors suffered broken bones and internal injuries in sub-zero temperatures. The second glider ditched in a fjord after its tug aircraft lost all navigational reference in clouds and icing. The crew drowned or died of hypothermia within minutes of hitting the water. Survivors from the mountain crash struggled through snow and darkness. Some died of exposure within hours. Others reached Norwegian farmhouses, where terrified families provided shelter despite the risks. German security forces captured 41 men over the following days through systematic searches and informant reports. Under Hitler's commando order, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht directive dated October 18, 1942, all captured commandos were to be annihilated to the last man, regardless of circumstances. The order was explicit. No prisoners, no trials, no quarter. Executions followed interrogation. Some men were shot. Others were sent to concentration camps where they died within weeks. The operation's objective was militarily sound. Sabotage heavy water production vital to German atomic research. Royal Engineers detachments selected for the mission carried demolition packages designed to exploit structural vulnerabilities in the plant's electrolysis halls. Shaped charges would destroy the high-pressure cylinders. Incendiary devices would ignite the facility. The technical planning was thorough. Special Operations executive contacts in Norway prepared reception and exfiltration routes. Norwegian resistance members agreed to guide survivors to Sweden. Safe houses were identified, escape routes mapped, but all contingency planning assumed the gliders would land intact. Terrain and weather defeated the mission before the raiders reached their objective. Winter icing exceeded all tolerances for glider tow profiles. The Halifax tugs struggled with ice accumulation on their own wings while trying to maintain course. Austere landing zones in mountainous terrain offered no margin for navigational error. Recovery options did not exist in occupied Norway during winter. No rescue, no second chances. German occupation authorities responded to freshmen with predictable brutality but also strategic caution. Security across Norway widened dramatically. Garrison strengths increased from 10,000 to over 30,000 troops by mid-1943. Patrol frequencies rose. The Gestapo intensified scrutiny of coastal populations, arresting suspected resistance members and terrorizing communities into cooperation. Over 30,000 German troops remained tied to Norway throughout 1943 and 1944, diverted from main fronts in Russia and Italy because the threat now demonstrably included airborne insertion at any point along the coast. Every fjord, every valley, every plateau became a potential landing zone that required surveillance. Although freshmen failed tactically with grievous losses, it achieved an unintended strategic effect. Forcing the enemy to guard everywhere meant the enemy was strong nowhere. German commanders could not distinguish between reconnaissance, raids, and precursors to invasion. The safe response was maximum vigilance, which consumed resources that might otherwise reinforce active combat zones. The Allies returned months later with a resistance-led ground sabotage mission, codenamed Gunnerside, which succeeded in damaging the Vemork plant. Norwegian commandos skied across the plateau, penetrated the facility, placed charges, and escaped into Sweden. The ground approach succeeded where the airborne operation had failed, but only because German security forces were spread thin watching for parachutists. British airborne planners absorbed every technical lesson from freshmen's failure. Glider towing limitations in icing conditions were documented and translated into operational restrictions. Navigation aids inadequate for mountain terrain prompted investment in improved systems. The need for emergency contingencies in hostile territory drove development of better survival equipment and exfiltration protocols. Failure taught more than success ever could. The lessons written in blood over Norwegian mountains informed every subsequent operation. Rows of C-47 Dakota aircraft stood under canvas shelters at airfields scattered across Tunisia and Libya. Ground crews performed maintenance in heat that exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Glider pilots drilled emergency release procedures in crosswinds that raised dust devils across the desert. Pathfinder teams rehearsed beacon placement and Aldous lamp signals until every man could execute in darkness without error. The 1st Airborne Division prepared for Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily scheduled for July. The operation would be the largest amphibious and airborne assault to date in the Mediterranean theater. British and American airborne forces would land ahead of seaborne troops, seizing key bridges and high ground to prevent Axis reinforcement of coastal defenses. Staff officers anticipated orderly night drops based on training exercises in England. Combat experience suggested otherwise. Wind shear at drop altitude scattered parachute sticks unless procedures matured beyond peacetime standards. Flak concentrations near coastal targets increased dispersal through evasive maneuvers and aircraft losses. Navigation aids required field validation under combat conditions where the enemy would actively attempt to disrupt them. RAF and United States Army Air Forces transport groups worked jointly to standardize procedures that would enable coordinated operations. Language differences, command structures, and equipment variations created friction that had to be resolved before combat. British Horsa gliders were towed differently than American Waco gliders. Drop altitudes varied between services. Radio frequencies required deconfliction. Tow speeds for Horsa gliders were established at 120 miles per hour, fast enough to maintain control, slow enough to reduce structural stress. Rope lengths were set at 350 feet, balancing control responsiveness against whip effects in turbulence. Loading tables specified configurations with precision. A Horsa could carry 25 troops in bench seats, or a Jeep plus a 6-pounder anti-tank gun with 4-man crew, or equivalent weight in ammunition and supplies. Portable beacons promised improved drop accuracy through radio navigation. The Eureka ground unit transmitted a homing signal. The Rebecca airborne interrogator aboard transport aircraft provided bearing and range to Pathfinder teams on the ground. The system worked reliably in testing but remained unproven in combat conditions with active enemy jamming and atmospheric interference. Field tests reduced but did not eliminate dispersal. 11% of gliders experienced mechanical failures during rehearsals, broken tow ropes, structural damage during release, control surface malfunctions. Wing stress incidents on Horsa-gliders prompted engineering investigations and structural reinforcements. An Air Ministry file, reference AM/43/112, recorded the principal lesson learned from exercises. Wind shear at drop altitude remains principal cause of loss. Engineers modified wing spars with composite reinforcement. Riggers adjusted tow bridle attachment points to distribute loads more evenly. The changes cut wing stress failures by 18%, documented meticulously in RAF engineering logs dated February 1944. Husky planning forced standardization across Allied airborne elements that would operate in the same airspace on the same night. Assembly areas received detailed reconnaissance through aerial photography and agent reports. Beacon discipline was enforced through repeated rehearsals. Anti-flak routing incorporated intelligence on German radar coverage and searchlight positions, plotting approach corridors that minimized exposure. Drop zones and landing zones were selected to minimize exposure during approach while maximizing tactical utility after landing. Terrain analysis identified areas with good visibility, minimal obstacles, and quick access to objectives. Every zone was photographed, measured, and modeled in briefing sandboxes. Over 1,400 glider pilots completed training by June 1943. 500 gliders were allocated for initial assault waves, an unprecedented commitment of resources. The scale exceeded all previous British airborne operations by an order of magnitude. The logistical challenge was enormous. Aircraft, crews, maintenance, fuel, and coordination across multiple airfields and services. The objective was strategically critical. Seize bridges and high ground in Sicily's eastern sector, preventing Axis reinforcement of coastal defenses while British and Canadian forces landed on beaches. Success would open a route for the 8th Army to advance rapidly inland. Failure would leave amphibious forces vulnerable to counterattack and jeopardize the entire invasion. The first test of large-scale airborne seizure of a critical choke point loomed at Primosole Bridge, spanning a river inland from Catania. The bridge was militarily vital, the only crossing for miles that could support armored vehicles. Its capture would enable rapid exploitation. Its loss would stall the invasion. Parachutes bloomed over a dark river line south of Catania at 22:30 hours on July 13. Winds exceeded forecast speeds by 15 knots. Sticks landed scattered across several square miles of agricultural land crisscrossed with stone walls and irrigation ditches. The 1st Parachute Brigade's objective was clear: seize and hold Primosole Bridge until relieved by advancing ground forces of the 8th Army. 1,856 paratroopers dropped between 22:30 hours on July 13 and 0100 hours on July 14. The drop zone had been carefully selected through aerial reconnaissance, but wind conditions scrambled all planning. 30% of the force landed more than 2 miles from designated drop zones. Some men came down in German positions and were killed or captured before they could assemble. The assembly took hours instead of minutes. Small groups fought independently toward the bridge, using compass bearings and map references to navigate through unfamiliar terrain in darkness. Whistles pierced the night as section leaders called their men together. Passwords were exchanged in harsh whispers. Equipment bundles containing heavy weapons and ammunition were scattered across the countryside, forcing soldiers to search blindly. Despite the fragmentation, advance parties reached the bridge by 0300 hours. Italian sentries, already unnerved by reports of parachute landings, withdrew without sustained resistance. British engineers moved quickly to the bridge structure, searching for demolition charges that might destroy the span before it could be secured. They found wired explosives at both ends and carefully disconnected the firing circuits. Demolition charges were located and disarmed with minutes to spare. German engineers had prepared the bridge for destruction but not yet armed the charges when British paratroopers arrived. The raiders established hasty defensive positions, positioning PIAT anti-tank weapons, projector, infantry, anti-tank, and establishing fields of fire along approach roads. German 1st Parachute Regiment elements counterattacked at dawn. The engagement became a meeting battle between two elite airborne formations. Both sides fought with similar tactics and comparable determination. The Germans had local superiority in numbers. The British held terrain advantage and defensive positions. PIAT anti-tank weapons and 6-pounder guns engaged German light armor attempting to rush the bridge. Radio communication suffered from limited range and atmospheric interference that plagued portable sets in built-up areas. Glider-delivered reinforcements arrived during daylight hours, bringing additional guns and ammunition despite heavy anti-aircraft fire. The bridge changed hands twice over 36 hours of continuous combat. British casualties mounted: 295 killed, 260 missing, many of whom were later confirmed dead or captured. German losses were comparable, with the 1st Parachute Regiment suffering over 300 casualties in attempts to retake the bridge. Italian units in the sector suffered complete collapse of morale after witnessing Allied air mobility. Entire companies surrendered or simply melted away into the countryside. The psychological impact of airborne troops appearing in their rear areas proved more decisive than actual combat power. The 50th Northumbrian Division, advancing from the beachhead through difficult terrain and German delaying positions, reached Primosole on the afternoon of July 15th. Relief was achieved, but operational delay cost the 8th Army critical momentum toward Catania. Axis defenders used the 48 hours to reinforce defensive positions north of the bridge, turning the approaches into killing grounds. Brigade after-action reports noted severe drop dispersal and communications gaps as primary problems requiring immediate attention. Yet the operation confirmed a vital principle. Even a scattered drop could paralyze a critical road and rail artery if individual soldiers fought toward their objectives with initiative and determination. The Axis reinforcement schedule toward Catania was disrupted for over 48 hours, time that allowed Allied ground forces to consolidate the beachhead and prepare for sustained operations inland. German mobile reserves that might have counterattacked the beaches instead became committed to containing airborne forces behind their lines. The operation demonstrated the premium on navigation accuracy and pathfinder aids. Lessons learned at Primosole informed planning for subsequent airborne operations throughout the Mediterranean and European campaigns. Technical solutions were sought for problems that training alone could not solve. Berlin drew a blunt lesson from Primosole that would shape German defensive planning for the remainder of the war. Rear areas needed standing anti-airborne alarm units positioned far from front lines, ready to respond to vertical envelopment at any point. By late 1943, German staffs began modeling all Allied offensive operations with the assumption that airborne forces would precede ground attacks. The psychological effect multiplied the tactical impact. German commanders could no longer assume their rear areas were secure. Every bridge, every crossroads, every headquarters became a potential target for troops descending from the night sky. A German Corps headquarters log recorded multiple parachutist sightings in sectors spanning from Normandy to the Netherlands. Most reports were unconfirmed. Duty officers filed paperwork, dispatched patrol units to investigate, and waited. Hours passed before each alert was classified as a false alarm or unsubstantiated rumor. The pattern repeated nightly across occupied territories. German staff had expected sporadic raids after Berneville demonstrated British capability. They encountered instead persistent alerts, real and false, that consumed reserves and degraded movement efficiency throughout the rear area network. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht and Oberkommando de Heer's rear area commands created ad hoc alarm companies throughout Western Europe. These Alarmkompanien were tasked specifically to counter airborne incursions. Security divisions received standing orders to respond to parachute alerts within 1 hour regardless of distance or ongoing operations. The organizational overhead was substantial. Each alarm company required barracks, weapons, vehicles, radios, and dedicated command staff. Troops assigned to anti-airborne duties could not simultaneously perform other missions. The force structure became brittle, with units locked into specialized roles that limited operational flexibility. Logistics suffered measurable friction at every echelon. Rail echelons carrying supplies forward faced clearance delays pending confirmation that tracks were secure from sabotage or airborne interdiction. Bridge guards increased rotation frequencies, requiring more manpower for the same coverage. Radar posts and signal nodes received additional anti-aircraft coverage, diverting light flak batteries from frontline support roles. Searchlight batteries were repositioned throughout France and Belgium to cover potential drop zones near depots and headquarters complexes. The batteries burned fuel and required crews, maintenance, spare parts, and command oversight. Every searchlight pointed at the sky was one less illuminating ground approaches to defensive positions. An Oberkommando der Wehrmacht signal dated late 1943 logged reports of parachutists in Brittany. Unconfirmed, the message was typical of hundreds that clogged communications networks. Duty officers had to process each report, cross-reference with other intelligence, dispatch patrols, and await confirmation. The procedure consumed hours and tied up radio nets needed for operational traffic. Movement orders acquired additional bureaucratic friction. Convoys required countersignatures from security officers before departing. Unit commanders needed clearance that routes were free of airborne activity. The approval process added delays measured in hours for tactical movements and days for operational redeployments. By early 1944, over 100,000 German troops were assigned to anti-airborne security roles in Western Europe. The number represented multiple divisions' worth of combat power removed from active fronts. 21 divisions maintained dedicated alarm companies. Light flak units were pulled from Eastern Front assignments where they were desperately needed against Soviet ground attack aircraft. Every alert delayed operational responses to actual threats. Reserves could not concentrate efficiently when standing orders required dispersion to guard against airborne landings that might occur anywhere within hundreds of miles. The cumulative efficiency loss magnified Allied deception efforts designed to create exactly this kind of uncertainty. Luftwaffe flak regiments reported increased ammunition expenditure on unconfirmed targets. Shadows, birds, weather balloons, and imagination all drew fire from nervous gunners. Abwehr counterintelligence sections chased rumors planted by Allied agents and resistance networks. Civilian populations in occupied territories were subjected to curfews and search operations following each alert, breeding resentment that fed resistance recruitment. The overhead grew exponentially without producing proportional security improvements. German commanders faced an impossible problem. Airborne forces could strike anywhere, but defending everywhere meant being strong nowhere. The mathematical reality was inescapable. British planners understood this dynamic and exploited it ruthlessly. Dummy parachute drops, weighted dummies with noise-making devices, triggered German responses indistinguishable from reactions to real operations. Special operations executive agents seeded false reports through resistance networks. Radio traffic simulations suggested preparation for airborne operations in sectors that would never see a single paratrooper. The British conducted fewer than 10 major airborne operations between Berneville in February 1942 and D-Day in June 1944. Yet Germany deployed resources equivalent to 10 combat divisions to counter a threat that materialized sporadically and unpredictably. The disproportion between threat and response was strategically significant. As D-Day approached, Britain armed its airborne forces with technological and doctrinal improvements refined through 3 years of operations and analysis. Superior gliders carried heavier loads. Improved radios provided better command and control. Navigation systems enhanced accuracy. Most importantly, the procedures for bridge seizure had been rehearsed, tested in combat, and codified into doctrine that could be executed by units that had never worked together before. The next airborne operation would validate every lesson learned and every resource invested since Churchill's directive in June 1940. 6th Airborne Division would land in Normandy with one objective: hold the eastern flank until seaborne forces could link up. Success would open the route to Germany. Failure was unthinkable. Horsa fuselage sections accepted jeeps and 6-pounder anti-tank guns under rigor supervision. Chalk inspection marks confirmed structural integrity after modifications. Pathfinders briefed on Rebecca beacon systems in classrooms converted from aircraft hangars. Aldous signal procedures were rehearsed on darkened runways until execution became automatic muscle memory. German planners believed night precision landings by glider were marginal at best. Intelligence assessments rated British glider capability as suitable only for small-scale raids in favorable conditions. The assessments were wrong. British practice had transformed glider operations from experimental novelty to reliable delivery system through systematic refinement of every component. Technical specifications matured into operational standards codified in field manuals. The Airspeed Horseglider, manufactured by furniture companies whose woodworking expertise translated surprisingly well to aircraft construction, could carry 25 troops in bench seats along the fuselage sides. Alternatively, it could transport a Jeep plus 6-pounder gun with 4-man crew, or equivalent weight in supplies packed into panniers and containers. Tow procedures were codified through hundreds of training flights. Approach altitude, 6,000 feet. Release altitude, 3,000 feet over the landing zone. Glide ratio, 15:1 under optimal conditions, degrading to 12:1 in turbulence or battle damage. Landing speed, 70 miles per hour on touchdown, requiring runways or fields at least 400 yards long. Structural reinforcements reduced wing stress incidents from 18% of flights to fewer than 5%. An RAF engineering log dated February 1944 recorded an 18% reduction in wing stress failures after composite reinforcement changes to wing spars and tow bridle attachment points. The modification saved lives and preserved combat power that would have been lost to preventable accidents. The Hamilcar heavy glider entered operational service capable of lifting loads previously considered impossible for air delivery. Capacity: 1 Tetrarch light tank weighing 7 tons, or 1 universal carrier, or equivalent weight in supplies. The glider's size enabled delivery of equipment that dramatically increased airborne units' combat power after landing. A light tank in the hands of paratroopers transformed defensive operations into mobile warfare. Signals technology advanced in parallel with aviation improvements. Eureka ground beacons transmitted on assigned frequencies in the high-frequency band. Each beacon had unique identification codes that prevented confusion when multiple Pathfinder teams operated in the same general area. Rebecca airborne interrogators provided bearing and range information to navigators aboard transport aircraft and glider tugs. The system reduced but did not eliminate scatter. Weather conditions, terrain masking, and enemy jamming all degraded performance. Yet even with imperfections, Rebecca Eureka provided accuracy far exceeding dead reckoning navigation or visual recognition of landmarks in darkness. Aldous lamp signals confirmed drop zones visually when electronic aids failed or required backup. Ground teams used colored filters and Morse code patterns to identify specific zones for different aircraft formations. Panel codes marked supply drop points with fabric layouts visible from altitude. The redundancy built into signaling procedures ensured that single-point failures did not cascade into mission failure. Logistics expanded to support divisional-scale operations requiring sustainment over multiple days. Thousands of containers were pre-packed with ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and specialized equipment. Each container was color-coded by content type and numbered for accountability. Aircraft allocation tables specified sorties for the first 48 hours of a landing, with follow-on waves scheduled at 12-hour intervals. Planners accounted for anticipated loss rates, 10% of aircraft to flak, navigation error, and mechanical failure, and built redundancy into lift schedules. Critical supplies were distributed across multiple aircraft to prevent catastrophic loss if single planes were shot down. The planning staff work was meticulous and unglamorous but absolutely essential. German glider capability lagged British advances by at least 2 years. The DFS-230 glider was useful for commando-scale assaults against point targets like the Belgian fort of Ebene, but its payload was limited to 9 troops or equivalent cargo. Night operational capability was minimal, with few pilots trained for instrument flying or darkness landings. Production numbers for German gliders remained low throughout the war. Manufacturing priority went to fighters and bombers. Transport aviation received minimal investment. The doctrinal emphasis remained on tactical surprise in daylight rather than sustained operations requiring heavy lift capacity. British lift, loads, and navigation matured to enable divisional-scale night actions with organic heavy weapons and vehicles. The system would be tested comprehensively east of the Orne River on the night before D-Day. Operation Tonga would employ the complete airborne toolkit developed since 1940. Pathfinders with electronic beacons, coup de main gliders landing directly on objectives, mass parachute drops delivering battalions to seize terrain, and follow-on glider waves carrying heavy equipment. The objective was operationally and strategically vital. Hold D-Day's eastern flank before seaborne troops appeared on the beaches at dawn. German armor approaching from the east had to be stopped or delayed long enough for the beachhead to consolidate. Failure would jeopardize the entire invasion. Gliders released over the Caen Canal in darkness at 2300 hours. The first coup de main party, 6 Horsa gliders carrying 180 men of D Company, Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, landed beside bridges later named Pegasus and Horsa. Touchdown occurred at 23:16 hours on June 5, 1944. The precision was remarkable. 3 gliders landed within 50 yards of the canal bridge, 3 more near the river bridge a half-mile distant. Assault troops exited gliders within seconds of landing. Doors flew open. Men poured out carrying weapons and explosives. German sentries at the canal bridge were neutralized in brief, savage close-quarters combat before they could trigger demolitions or raise alarms. Italian workers building fortifications nearby scattered into darkness. Engineers moved immediately to the bridge structure, searching for demolition charges that might destroy the span. They found wired explosives prepared for rapid detonation but not yet armed. The charges were carefully disconnected and removed. Within 15 minutes of landing, the bridge was secured and prepared for defense. German sector staff received fragmented reports as the night progressed. Initial assessments classified the action as diversionary, a raid similar to Brunival meant to distract from the main invasion expected elsewhere. The scale became apparent only after dawn, when reconnaissance patrols discovered that British airborne forces held multiple key crossings and occupied high ground east of the Orne River in divisional strength. The 6th Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Richard Gale, dropped 8,500 men during the night between 23:30 hours and 0200 hours. Aircraft approached from the sea, crossing the coast at multiple points to complicate German anti-aircraft response. Pathfinders jumped first, marking drop zones with Rebecca Eureka beacons and Aldous lamps. The 5th Parachute Brigade secured drop zones inland near Ranville and established blocking positions to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the bridges. Individual battalions fought toward their assigned objectives through scattered landings and unexpected resistance. The 9th Parachute Battalion drew the most difficult assignment: assault the Merville Battery. The Merville Battery consisted of 4 concrete casemates housing guns that could engage Sword Beach with enfilade fire. Intelligence indicated the guns were 150mm caliber, large enough to devastate landing craft. The battery was protected by minefields, barbed wire, machine gun positions, and a garrison of over 100 German troops. The 9th Battalion dropped scattered. Only 150 men from a planned strength of 600 reached the assembly area. Heavy equipment bundles containing Bangalore torpedoes and scaling ladders were lost in the drop. Gliders carrying jeeps and anti-tank guns missed the landing zone. The battalion commander faced an impossible decision: attack with inadequate force or accept that the battery would remain operational during the invasion. He attacked. The assault went in at 0430 hours. Bangalore torpedoes blew gaps in wire obstacles. Assault teams rushed the casemates under machine gun fire. The fighting was close range and brutal. British casualties exceeded 50%. Yet the battery was neutralized, guns damaged, ammunition expended, garrison killed or captured. The battery did not fire on Sword Beach. Resupply canisters arrived at first light, dropped by follow-on waves of transport aircraft. Supply drops were less accurate than troop drops due to anti-aircraft fire and smoke from burning vehicles. Some containers landed in German positions. Others fell into flooded areas and could not be recovered. Yet enough supplies reached British positions to sustain combat operations. Division casualties across the initial 72-hour period totaled approximately 2,200 killed, wounded, and missing. The cost was heavy but acceptable relative to the operational result. An eastern flank shield for the beachhead that prevented German armor from reaching Sword Beach during the critical morning hours when landing forces were most vulnerable. General Gale's after-action note, dated June 10, 1944, observed, "Enemy reaction slow and confused. Radar reports contradictory. German commanders had not anticipated large-scale night airborne operations delivered with this level of precision and coordination. Their response was fragmented across multiple command levels and delayed by uncertainty about Allied intentions. Airborne preemption narrowed German counterattack options fundamentally. The 21st Panzer Division, positioned near Cannes and capable of reaching the beaches within 2 hours, was delayed by reports of airborne landings across its projected axis of advance. When the division finally moved, it encountered blocking positions and had to fight for every kilometer. The lodgement's eastern shoulder held throughout June 6 and beyond. Ground forces advancing from Sword Beach linked with airborne units by 1000 hours. The seam between amphibious and airborne forces closed. The beachhead began to consolidate. The operational plan succeeded despite scattered drops, heavy casualties, and improvisation under fire. The next major airborne commitment would attempt a more ambitious objective: a leap across multiple major rivers in daylight under a stronger and more alert enemy. The risks would be correspondingly greater. Market Garden would test whether airborne forces could seize and hold an extended corridor against sustained German counterattacks. Mass transport aircraft and gliders crossed the Dutch border in daylight at 1400 hours on September 17. The Armada stretched for miles, C-47 Dakotas, British Sterlings and Halifaxes towing Horsa and Hamilcar gliders, fighter escorts weaving protective patterns above the formations. Flak rose from German positions along the route. Drop zones and landing zones across Holland filled with parachutes and gliders in the largest single-day airborne operation of the war. Operation Market Garden committed 34,876 Allied airborne and glider troops to a corridor stretching 60 miles from the Belgian border to Arnhem. The plan was operationally audacious. Seize bridges over multiple rivers and canals, hold them until British armor advancing along a single highway could relieve each position in sequence, then drive into Germany's industrial heartland before winter halted operations. The plan assumed German resistance would be light and disorganized. Intelligence assessments rated German armor strength near Arnhem as minimal, perhaps 1 battalion of obsolete tanks refitting after withdrawals from France. The assumptions were catastrophically wrong. 2nd SS Panzer Corps, 2 divisions totaling approximately 10,000 combat veterans with modern tanks, was refitted in the Arnhem area. British intelligence detected their presence through aerial reconnaissance but assessed them as non-operational. The assessment missed that German maintenance crews had restored significant combat power within days of arrival. The British 1st Airborne Division landed at Arnhem with the objective of seizing the road bridge over the Rhine, the final bridge in the corridor and the gateway to Germany. 10,095 men landed on drop zones and landing zones 6 to 8 miles from the bridge. The distance was imposed by terrain and anti-aircraft concentrations, but it gave German defenders time to react. Initial progress was rapid. Lead elements of the 2nd Parachute Battalion reached the bridge's northern end by 2000 hours on September 17 and established a defensive perimeter. Radio communication failed across the divisional area due to inadequate equipment, terrain interference, and German jamming. The battalion at the bridge was cut off from division headquarters with no way to coordinate support or relief. The German response was immediate and professional. 2nd SS Panzer Corps committed armor and infantry to contain the British perimeter around the bridge and to block other battalions attempting to fight through from the drop zones. Street fighting in Arnhem suburbs consumed British strength without gaining ground. Resupply drops fell into German hands because ground forces could not reach drop zones to mark them properly. The bridge position was held for 4 days under continuous attack. Ammunition ran low. Casualties mounted. Buildings were reduced to rubble around the defenders. Yet the position held until September 21, when German armor finally overwhelmed the perimeter through sheer weight of fire. Survivors were killed or captured. The remainder of the division fought a perimeter defense around Oosterbeek, west of Arnhem, waiting for relief that never arrived. British armor advancing along Hell's Highway was stopped repeatedly by German defenses that exploited the single-axis approach. Each bridge became a choke point. Each blown bridge or destroyed vehicle created delays measured in hours or days. Evacuation across the Rhine occurred on the night of September 25 under cover of darkness and artillery fire. 2,163 men escaped across the river in assault boats and rafts. The remainder of the division, over 7,000 men, were killed, missing, or captured. The casualty rate exceeded 70%. Losses in the United States 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, operating farther south along the corridor, were substantial but lower. Both divisions seized their objectives and held them until relieved. But without the Arnhem Bridge, the corridor led nowhere. The operation achieved tactical success in 2 sectors and catastrophic failure in the third. A 2nd SS Corps War Diary entry recorded, "Enemy airborne landings at Arnhem. Scale unprecedented." German staff had not anticipated an airborne operation of this magnitude, delivering an entire division so deep behind their lines. The psychological shock was strategic despite the tactical defeat. From autumn 1944 forward, German rear areas operated under the fundamental assumption that every Allied offensive would begin with airborne forces. Planning assumptions changed across the entire Western Front. Reserve deployments factored in the threat of vertical envelopment. Resources were diverted to guard potential drop zones far from active fronts. Market Garden failed to achieve its operational objectives. The British Army did not reach Germany in 1944. The war would continue into 1945. Yet the operation imposed a cost on German planning that far exceeded the immediate tactical losses. German commanders could no longer assume their rear areas were inviolate. Every offensive, every defensive line, every logistics network now had to account for the possibility that British or American airborne forces might appear in unexpected places at unexpected times. The planning overhead, resource dispersion, and psychological burden of that threat shaped German operations for the remainder of the war. Fear of what had already happened at Arnhem influenced decisions far from Holland. Market Garden's ultimate effect was not measured in bridges held or casualties inflicted, but in German strength diverted from where it was needed most. Night phones rang at a Wehrmacht rear area headquarters near Dusseldorf. Another parachute alert. The duty officer took the report from a nervous sentry who claimed to have seen parachutes descending near a rail junction. A supply train carrying ammunition forward to the Siegfried line stopped on a siding, awaiting clearance to proceed. Guards reported unconfirmed sightings, shadows in moonlight, sounds that might be aircraft engines, movement that could be enemy infiltrators. The duty officer logged the report according to standing procedures and dispatched patrol units to investigate. Search teams moved through darkness with dogs and portable searchlights. Hours passed while rail traffic backed up behind the stopped train. The alert was eventually classified as false. No parachutes found, no equipment recovered, no enemy contact. The train resumed movement at dawn. Operational tempo suffered another measurable delay. Germany expected to concentrate reserves for the Ardennes offensive, the last major counterattack in the West designed to split Allied armies and recapture Antwerp. Simultaneously, Rhine defenses required strengthening against inevitable Allied crossings. Yet standing orders pulled light anti-aircraft batteries and infantry companies into static guarding of depots, bridges, and communication nodes hundreds of miles from any combat zone. Army Group B maintained anti-airborne security as a permanent operational overhead that consumed resources without producing measurable defensive improvements. Every alert, whether real or false, triggered responses that degraded efficiency across the logistics network. Reassignment of light flak units to rear area protection reduced available fire support at front lines where Allied fighter bombers attacked with impunity. The 2 cm and 3.7 cm flak guns were effective against low-flying aircraft but were locked into static positions guarding facilities that were never attacked. Documented friction times for rail movement under alert conditions averaged 2 to 4 hours per incident. Alerts occurred multiple times weekly across sectors spanning from Holland to Alsace. An Army Group B memorandum dated December 1944 stated with bureaucratic precision, "Enemy airborne activity now expected anywhere, Anytime, the assessment drove resource allocation decisions that weakened operational concentration at the decisive point. Reserves that should have been massed for the Ardennes offensive were instead dispersed across rear areas to counter threats that existed primarily in planning assumptions. Allied deception efforts amplified German uncertainty through systematic exploitation of known fears. Special operations executive networks and resistance groups seeded false reports of parachute sightings, equipment caches, and suspicious activity. Dummy equipment drops, weighted bags attached to parachutes with noise-making devices, triggered German responses indistinguishable from reactions to real operations. German military intelligence struggled to distinguish actual threats from elaborate feints. Abwehr counterintelligence sections investigated hundreds of reports monthly. Most proved false. Some were deliberately planted by Allied agents. A few were genuine but misidentified resistance supply drops or training exercises far from German positions. The signal-to-noise ratio became so poor that genuine intelligence was lost in the flood of false data. The Ardennes offensive timetable suffered delays attributable in part to rear-area security requirements that consumed time and resources. Panzer divisions moving from rest areas to jump-off positions faced security clearance checks at bridges and road junctions. Fuel convoys required armed escorts through rear areas supposedly secured but actually vulnerable. Command posts relocated to reduce vulnerability to airborne raids that existed primarily in German imaginations. Movement schedules included padding for security delays that could not be predicted but had to be accommodated. A panzer division that should have reached its assembly area in 12 hours instead required 18 hours when factoring in security stops, route clearances, and alert responses. The cumulative delay across multiple divisions added days to the offensive timeline, days that allowed Allied forces to detect the buildup and prepare countermeasures. The threat of dissent diluted operational mass, delayed movements, and complicated logistics throughout the German war effort. Fear itself became a British airborne effect multiplier whose impact exceeded any single operation. The cost was measurable in tangible metrics. Divisions held in reserve to counter airborne threats could not be committed forward to decisive battles. Flak batteries guarded depots and bridges instead of supporting frontline infantry against Allied air attacks. Movement schedules consumed time that could never be recovered under the pressure of Allied advances from east and west. As the Reich contracted geographically in early 1945, the disproportion between threat and response became more acute. Fewer resources guarding more potential targets meant every alert carried a higher opportunity cost. German commanders faced impossible choices: concentrate forces for counterattacks and accept rear area vulnerability, or disperse forces for security and lack offensive punch. One more airborne formation would demonstrate the ultimate political utility of vertical forces, reaching a politically significant objective first, without firing a shot, simply by being present before the competition arrived. British airborne columns entered a Baltic port city in late afternoon under overcast skies. White flags hung from windows throughout the town center. German civilians watched from doorways as trucks and jeeps of the 6th Airborne Division rolled through cobblestone streets. Local German civil authorities waited at the town hall with surrender documents prepared according to Wehrmacht procedures that no longer carried authority. Soviet units were approaching from the east, perhaps 6 hours distant. The race for occupation lines in northern Germany was decided not by armored spearheads but by light infantry moved rapidly in wheeled vehicles across roads cleared by collapsing German resistance. The closing weeks of the war had suggested that armored formations would dictate political boundaries through speed and firepower. Instead, the 6th Airborne Division, transported by truck rather than parachute but retaining its airborne designation and light equipment, moved faster than heavier units. The division fixed a boundary consistent with Allied agreements negotiated at Yalta and confirmed through military coordination with Soviet headquarters. The political objective was achieved without combat. German forces in the sector were collapsing under Soviet pressure from multiple directions. Remaining Wehrmacht units sought to surrender to British or American forces rather than face Soviet captivity. Resistance to British entry into Wismar would have been pointless and suicidal. Participants in the final race included elements of the 6th Airborne Division traveling by motor transport, local German civil authorities attempting to maintain order during the collapse, and advancing Soviet formations moving westward after crushing German defenses along the Oder River. Montgomery's 21st Army Group directed movements from headquarters near Lüneburg, ensuring British forces reached designated demarcation lines before formal negotiations began with Soviet counterparts. Operations in the final days consisted of rapid marches along roads clogged with refugees and surrendering German soldiers, hasty river crossings on intact or hastily repaired bridges, and patrols to secure key facilities including ports and communication centers. German military resistance was minimal to non-existent. The primary challenge was managing the chaos of military collapse and civilian displacement. Documentation of occupation lines proceeded according to inter-Allied protocols established months earlier. Liaison officers met Soviet counterparts to confirm boundaries. Maps were marked, checkpoints established. The administrative work of ending the war in Europe proceeded with surprising orderliness given the preceding years of total war. A 21st Army Group report dated May 1945 noted with some satisfaction, "Parachute forces achieved without armor what conventional divisions could not accomplish with it. Presence at the politically decisive point before competitors arrived, the observation captured British airborne forces' final contribution to victory, demonstrating that strategic effect derived not solely from firepower but from speed, flexibility, and the will to reach objectives first." The operation demonstrated airborne forces' political utility in the war's final phase when combat operations gave way to occupation and negotiation. Light infantry, moved quickly by available transport and positioned decisively at key locations, achieved strategic effects disproportionate to their combat power. The lesson was immediately apparent to military planners thinking ahead to post-war security challenges and potential confrontations with former allies. Post-war analysts in both Britain and the United States attempted to quantify an intangible strategic effect. How many German troops, artillery pieces, flak batteries, and supply trains were locked away from decisive battles because of paratroopers who might appear but often did not? The strategic reckoning began immediately with captured documents, staff diaries compiled during the Reich's final months, and interrogations of German commanders who had experienced 3 years of airborne threat. A British staff analyst in the historical section reviewed captured Oberkommando der Wehrmacht papers in a Berlin archive building that had survived Allied bombing. Anti-airborne directives, guard schedules for depots and bridges, situation maps marked with flak positions protecting rear area installations. The documents revealed the cumulative cost of defending against a threat that materialized sporadically but could theoretically appear anywhere. Germany had budgeted for strategic bombing of cities and conventional combat on multiple fronts. German planners had not adequately budgeted for small airborne forces that seized bridges before they could be demolished, stole irreplaceable technology from supposedly secure installations, and paralyzed logistics movements through persistent threat of interdiction. The dispersion penalty was measurable through retrospective analysis comparing German force deployments to operational requirements. Resources committed to rear area security could not simultaneously support frontline operations. Every soldier guarding a depot was one less rifle in a frontline trench. Every flak gun protecting a bridge was unavailable to defend against Allied tactical aircraft supporting ground advances. Oberkommando der Wehrmacht and Oberkommando der Heer staff officers who survived the war and remained available for interrogation documented resources committed to anti-airborne roles. Over 250,000 German troops were assigned to rear area security duties, specifically targeting airborne threats in Western Europe during 1944 and 1945. The number represented approximately 20 divisions worth of manpower, combat power that could have reinforced collapsing fronts in Normandy, Italy, or the Eastern Front. Flak reassignments reduced fire support at active combat zones where it was desperately needed. Light anti-aircraft guns effective against Allied fighter bombers and ground attack aircraft were instead positioned at rail junctions and supply depots far from any fighting. The opportunity cost was measured in Allied aircraft that operated with impunity over German positions because local flak defenses had been stripped for rear area protection. Movement inefficiencies compounded understanding alert protocols that required clearances, inspections, and delays every time an airborne threat was reported or suspected. A panzer division that should have completed a tactical redeployment in 1 day instead required 3 days when accounting for security stops and route verification. The friction accumulated across hundreds of movements over months of operations. British Cabinet Offices and War Office historical sections synthesized operational results beginning in late 1945 and continuing through the early 1950s. Telecommunications research establishment scientists at Malvern credited the Berneville raid with enabling counter-radar technological leaps that proved decisive in the strategic bombing campaign. The captured Würzburg components informed development of window chaff, which was successfully employed over Hamburg in July 1943, creating radar confusion that allowed bombers to devastate the city with minimal losses. Formation historians of the 1st and 6th Airborne Divisions compiled comprehensive statistics spanning the war years. Operations conducted, objectives achieved, casualties sustained both in training and combat, enemy forces diverted from frontline duty to guard against airborne threats. The data supported quantitative analysis of cost-effectiveness, comparing resources invested in airborne capability against strategic effects achieved. Quantitative themes emerged consistently from archival research across multiple institutions. Growth of German rear-area guard obligations correlated directly with expansion of British airborne capability from battalion scale in 1942 to divisional scale by 1944. Dispersion penalties in German force employment increased measurably after each Allied airborne operation, with Market Garden producing the most dramatic effect despite its tactical failure. Market Garden losses, over 7,000 British casualties at Arnhem, were substantial and painful. Yet those losses were weighed against strategic effects that persisted long after the battle ended. German reserves dispersed across hundreds of miles of rear areas, flak batteries repositioned away from frontline support roles, movement schedules degraded by persistent security requirements, and psychological burden on commanders who could never be certain their rear areas were secure. An Oberkommando der Wehrmacht summary document dated 1945, one of the final administrative actions of a dying military organization, stated with bitter clarity, "The enemy's airborne threat forced dispersion of our strength beyond any possibility of repair or recovery." The admission was remarkable, coming from an organization that rarely acknowledged strategic mistakes in official documentation. British post-war synthesis, compiled over several years by multiple analytical teams, concluded that airborne forces never exceeded 52,000 troops, approximately 3% of total British Army strength, yet altered enemy dispositions repeatedly and disproportionately across the entire Western theater. The force multiplier effect was undeniable when measured against resources diverted and opportunities foreclosed to German commanders. From a 120-man raid at Berneville in February 1942 to divisional-scale landings in Normandy and Holland, British airborne actions imposed costs that exceeded their size by orders of magnitude. Scientific gains in radar technology and electronic warfare. Bridge control during critical phases of amphibious assaults when seaborne forces were most vulnerable. Persistent rear area paralysis that degraded German operational efficiency throughout 1944 and into 1945. The final assessment, written by staff officers who had lived through the war and now attempted to understand its patterns, was clear and factual. British airborne forces came from nowhere, descending from night skies without warning, appearing behind supposedly secure lines, striking targets thought invulnerable. Therefore, to German commanders responsible for rear area security and operational planning, nowhere felt truly secure. No bridge could be assumed safe from sudden seizure. No depot guaranteed free from raid. No headquarters protected from surprise attack. That psychological and operational burden, sustained across 3 years of continuous operations and false alarms, contributed measurably to the erosion of German defensive capability. The cumulative effect of resource dispersion, delayed movements, diverted combat power, and constant uncertainty degraded German military effectiveness more than any single battle or campaign. The threat from the sky, realized in dramatic operations like Arnhem or implied through false alerts and deception, froze reserves that might have turned battles, diverted flak that might have protected retreating armies, and created vulnerabilities that Allied ground forces exploited systematically from Normandy to the Elbe River. In the final accounting, British airborne forces achieved strategic effects disproportionate to their numbers through a combination of actual operations, threatened operations, and the enemy's inability to distinguish between the two. They proved that modern war was as much psychological as physical, that fear of what might happen could be as powerful as what actually did happen. The lesson would shape military thinking for decades after the war ended. Vertical envelopment changed defensive calculations fundamentally, forcing dispersal and uncertainty on defenders while providing attackers with options that conventional forces alone could never achieve. If you value precise, document-based military history told through verified records and numbers, consider supporting this channel to sustain archival research and production. What is your perspective on this part of history? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every memory and reflection helps keep the past alive.